Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Louise Furey. Louise is the Curator of Archaeology at the Auckland War Memorial Museum, an institution which partners with the University of Auckland. In this role, she is responsible for Maori archaeological collections, materials excavated from historic sites, for Pacific archaeological collections, as well as associated material, archaeological material collected worldwide. Louise is a gardener herself and is linked to both the soil and to Maori heritage through growing traditional form of kumara. Like many of us, she's experienced at understanding the challenges of microclimates and their influence on successful gardening. It's through the work of researchers such as Louise that we learn about the development and appreciation of traditional cultures, how they worked and how they survived, as well as how their practices are relevant to us today. Please welcome Louise and enjoy what she has to share with us.
Thank you, John. Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm here to calm you down after Hamish's talk and perhaps put you to sleep. I apologise, I'm going to read this because it's a form of self-discipline to stop me just going on and on. So, for many years, understanding of pre-European Māori gardening in Aotearoa was derived from ethnographic and historic accounts, and in the last 60 years from archaeological research. There is now increasing use of microscopic techniques to support and enhance the archaeological findings. The detailed analysis of sediment cores can provide direct evidence of the crops grown, the surrounding environment, and the impact of gardening activities. So firstly, in this talk, I will set the scene for the long pre-Polynesian and Polynesian tradition of gardening, and then discuss the adaptiveness of Māori gardeners in Aotearoa, and finally talk about the recent research I've been involved in with the University of Auckland on Ahoo, Great Mercury Island. Polynesian ancestors voyaged into the Western Pacific around 3,000 to 3,500 years ago. There's no one island that we can identify as the homeland of origin, but the general homeland area includes Taiwan, the Philippines, and islands Southeast Asia. The people are highly visible archaeologically after settling on the already populated Bismarck Islands just to the north of New Guinea. They made a distinctive style of pottery with unique decorative motifs, which enables us to see them archaeologically. The Lapita people, as they are commonly known, incorporated plants already domesticated in the region into the suite of plants that they brought with them from their homeland. Lapita people travelled eastward from island to island over short water distances as far as Fiji, Tonga and Samoa, and all of this occurred over a 500-year period. In Tonga and Samoa, the Lapita culture evolved in isolation. In other words, there was no further backward movement into the previous cultures, into what we now call Polynesian culture. The way people arranged their settlements, their toolkits, and the language changed. And in ceramics, plainware replaced the decorated ceramics, and vessel shapes became simplified before the ceramics stopped being made altogether. A technological development in watercraft about 1,000 years ago, allowed, I apologise, I'll read that again. A technological development in watercraft about 1,000 years later allowed the early Polynesians to continue the journey eastward over the large water gap, which had been the barrier to further ocean exploration and settlement. So island groups in eastern Polynesia, particularly the Marquesas and the Society Islands, were settled around 1100 AD, the Cook Islands around 11 to 1200 AD, Hawaii and Rapa Nui also around 1200 AD, Rapa Nui being Easter Island, and Aotearoa, New Zealand, around 1300. And because of radiocarbon dating and its plus or minuses, we can't get it down to a single year. So it's around that period. It was technologically more difficult to sail to New Zealand from either the Cooks or Tahiti. And for several reasons, archaeologists don't believe that there was return voyaging once they arrived here. So New Zealand and the Chatham Islands were the last inhabitable land masses in the world to be occupied. And it was here in New Zealand that Polynesians became Māori. And that change happened almost as soon as they set foot on land. With the naming of new trees, language develops. The climate of New Zealand, the temperate climate, meant that they had to make changes to the Polynesian way of life that they had been living for some time. So there is some debate amongst archaeologists on the nature of Polynesian contact with South America, an important subject for understanding how kumara, or sweet potato, which is endemic to northern Peru and southeast Ecuador, arrived in Polynesia. One camp holds that South Americans sailed westward into Polynesia, and the other that Polynesians who already had suitable craft capable of travelling large distances across oceans and the navigation skills to follow the stars, sailed to the South American coast, acquired kumara, which is also its South American name, and the bottle gourd, and returned to Polynesia. This event likely happened in the same period as the easternmost margins of Polynesia were being settled, islands like Mangareva and Easter Island. As Lapita people and then the Polynesians travelled across the Pacific, they carried with them the plants and animals necessary to maintain their way of life and to establish their gardens. Coconut, banana, arrowroot, taro, yam, breadfruit were the staple carbohydrate crops, but other plants included sugarcane, paper mulberry, from which tapa is made, tea, the cabbage tree, cordyline, pandanus, bamboo, Malay apple, ginger, turmeric, and shaddock, which is a citrus, were also on these voyaging waka. In addition, there were plants favoured for their fibres and wood, which were distributed by Polynesians across the Pacific. So this range of tree crops and vegetables led to diverse garden regime with some long-term and some annual crops. The range of domesticated plants grown was most suited to the tropical zone. The further south Polynesians settled, staple crops became more difficult or near impossible to grow. In the subtropical zone on eastern Polynesia, the more seasonal variation led to the reduction in the species grown, and at the margins of Polynesia, Rapa Nui Easter Island, and the leeward side of the Hawaiian Islands, and New Zealand, a monoculture root crop garden system developed based on kumara, which was tolerant of drier and cooler climates. So New Zealand was well outside the optimal growing zone for all species and provided particular challenges for even the hardiest crops. In the tropical zone, crops could be grown continuously. Kumara harvested, that one of the root nodes, the leaf nodes could be replanted and start all over again. Contrasting with New Zealand, where crops could only be grown in the warmer months, and on the Chatham Islands, could not be grown at all. So as an aside, the commensal animals that the Polynesians brought with them, the dog, the pig, the chicken, and the rat, are also distributed unevenly across Polynesia, and the chicken and the pig were not brought to New Zealand at all. It is likely that the choice of what to grow where was complex, and related to practical considerations, including what survived the journey, plant tolerances, gardeners' preferences, and environmental conditions. And that cultural perspective was important. Some foods were considered prestige foods and enhanced the mana or the importance of chiefs. Some plants may have been persisted with even though difficult to grow because they were the food of the ancestors. In the same way that today we might continue to grow grandmother's rhubarb, even though it's a stubborn plant and doesn't grow very well, or mother's favourite rose. So what did garden landscapes look like in Polynesia? It's the immediate homeland of Māori from Aotearoa. Most Polynesian high islands are volcanic in origin, so they have friable soils, lava flows, deep valleys and fringing coastal flats. There is physical evidence of garden walls made of stone, garden path edgings, stone enclosures, and reticulated water systems for growing taro. These features have persisted and been transplanted from one island to another. Cropping was a mixture of a range of tree and annual crops grown in a landscape of actively used gardens adjacent to abandoned gardens. A fallowing system of land use was followed, where a plot was used for several years and then rested to allow soil fertility to build up again under vegetation cover and then burnt to return the potash to the soil. So undoubtedly, the Polynesian settlers transported all of their crops on the waka or canoes to New Zealand, but most would not have survived the cooler conditions here. Only kumara, and you can see here one of the traditional forms of Māori kumara, which I grow, tapatini, taro, yam, and hue, the bottle gourd, and then tea and cordyline and paper mulberry or aute for making tapa were growing when Europeans arrived in 1769. Yam and aute were rarely seen, and taro was observed more regularly, but kumara was the main crop grown. In addition, only parts of New Zealand were suitable for growing the tropical crops, and the length of growing season was restricted to the warmer months. So most of the gardens are found in the northern half of the North Island. The relatively short growing season of 5 to 6 months from late spring to early autumn meant taro and yam, which require a longer growing period, would rarely reach maturity. Kumara, on the other hand, matures after 4 to 5 months, but temperature variations meant gardens in the lower North Island and the South Island would have been marginal or failed to thrive in poor summers, where an early frost or a late one could destroy the crop. For instance, research by Helen Leach from Otago University, who I believe is a member of the society, she did a lot of research in the Wairarapa area to the east of Wellington and showed that extensive stone-walled gardens had been abandoned by about 1500 AD when it's believed the climate cooled slightly. So generally speaking, to overcome the constraints of the New Zealand climate, gardeners sought out or created conditions which enhanced the chance of success of their plants. For instance, gardens were developed on shingle fans or coastal terraces, on garden soils containing rocks, volcanic soils containing rocks, which warmed the soil earlier in the season. Gravel and volcanic tephra was added to heavier soils, and gardens were placed on north-facing slopes. And locations such as islands, might be 1 or 2 degrees warmer, were favoured. In addition, maintaining soil fertility was the key consideration, and like all oceanic gardeners, Māori operated a fallow system of resting land after a few years of cropping. Landscapes close to the coast would have had a mosaic of gardens, fallowing, regenerating areas, and intact forest, similar to this drawing from 1769. And so this is Anara Bay, up on the east coast of the North Island, and you can see the gardens situated in here. So visible evidence of gardens in Aotearoa includes stone mounds, stone rows and stone alignments, which indicate pathways or boundaries, just a stone, and replicates the method of plot gardening in Polynesia. And you can see these two examples are from the Wairarapa area, the stone row enclosures here and down here, and the little borrow pits, which I'll also mention, which contain where the gravel is extracted and added to the gardens. Other evidence of gardening includes regular arrangements of shallow trenches down slopes, or a grid pattern of trenches on flat land, which are mainly confined to the warmer northern areas. This is on Ahoo, Great Mercury, which I will talk about. And you can see just these faint lines through here and running across the landscape down here. They're quite difficult to photograph. There are also depressions called borrow pits in some regions, which indicate where sand and gravel were extracted and added to the gardens. And this is an example of one of these, where these big borrow pits in the Waikato region, in the centre of the North Island, this gravel, the tephra, coming down the river, the sand, Waikato River, have been extracted out of the borrow pits and put into depressions, and then the kumara grown in there. But in some locations, there were no modifications were required at all. In other words, optimal garden soils. And so gardens are not easily detected. Generally, Māori gardens were near the coast or in major river valleys, and were mainly in the upper half of the North Island. So it's evident from European accounts that the kumara was the dominant crop. Tubers or plants were grown on puki, or small mounds, following the traditional way of growing yams. The mounds were arranged in rows and with adjacent row offset. Plots were surrounded by brush fences, presumably to keep the marauding birds like weka out of the gardens and to provide windbreaks. Stone rows or enclosures acted in a similar fashion. Taro was reportedly grown at the base of slopes where there was moisture, but irrigated taro was not observed. Accounts of the yam gardens are rare and were soon replaced after Europeans arrived by the introduced crops. But a proxy for gardening is the presence of storage pits. Kumara had to be harvested in the autumn and the tubers stored over the winter for replanting in spring, or stored for eating. Semi-underground storage pits with an A-frame roof structure with earth heaped over the top helped to maintain even temperatures for the tubers during the winter. And the rectangular outline of many of these pits can be found on ridgetops or on terraces in settlements. However, kumara retained importance even after competition from potatoes, European introduced potatoes. There's now a renaissance in growing traditional Māori kumara varieties. The number of varieties brought to New Zealand is unknown, but Colenso in the 1880s named 32 varieties in Northland, which ranged from white-skinned with white flesh through to purple-skinned with purple flesh. Different varieties were known for their high yield, their sweetness, flavour, and the ability to produce large tubers. Some of the varieties may have been more tolerant of variation in temperature, but there are only 3 varieties that we know of that still exist. Experiments with growing the Tapatini variety at Robin Hood Bay in the Upper South Island near Blenheim in the early 2000s indicated a yield around the equivalent of 7.6 tonnes per hectare was possible in that climate. I grow the same variety on the Coromandel Peninsula, and last year produced the equivalent of 43 tonnes per hectare. Although in less favourable summers, I've had a yield of about half of that weight, and I think last summer was just an exceptionally hot summer for us. The yields support the notion that the warmer northern climates produce higher yields. Now I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about some really interesting discoveries that we have found on Ahoo. So I'm involved in this research with the University of Auckland, and we've been working there for the last 7 years. And it's off the Coromandel eastern coast. The island features in Maori migration traditions, which recount Ahoo as being the homeland of the kumara. There are a range of garden-related places on the island, including stone rows and stone-faced garden terraces and the surface shallow channels, which I showed in a previous slide. A paleobotanist, Matthew Prebble from the Australian National University, has been working with the archaeologists to investigate the vegetational history of the island. Organic matter is preserved in anaerobic conditions such as swamps, and by coring swamps and identifying the charcoal fragments, pollen and seeds, a history of vegetation and sediment changes has been reconstructed. 2 swamps have a history going back thousands of years into pre-human times and show stable conditions and slow build-up of organic matter, which includes Bahutakawa, Puriri, Rimu, cordyline species, and nikau. There's no charcoal indicative of fires and very little sediment build-up. In other words, it's definitely a pre-human landscape. The presence of large podocarp trees such as kauri, which dominate the mainland vegetation only 7 kilometres away, is likely to have been seen as an advantage to the early Maori gardeners, as the more open vegetation present on the island required less effort to clear. One swamp in particular, at Waititoki, so this is Tamawera, one of these swamps, and there's the sediment coring. The sediment cores go down about 3 metres into this anaerobic swamp. But one swamp in particular, Waititoki, has changed what we think about early Māori gardening. In the early decades of the 14th century, a volcanic eruption called Kaharoa, which Hamish spoke about, deposited a thin layer of volcanic ash over Ahoo and is preserved in the swamp. And immediately on top of the Kaharoa tephra, there was a high incidence of charcoal. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about this, this particular slide, which is the result of the pollen core. And you can see here that this line through here is the Kaharoa ash, which is preserved in the swamp. This is the charcoal concentration, and you can see there's absolutely nothing underneath it, and then above it, you get a lot of charcoal. The species of plants present in the sediment core after this burning event changed. So we start to get bracken fern, which is indicative of a disturbed environment, tutu and manuka appearing in quantity in the pollen core. Raupo pollen, the typhus, also occurs, indicating a damper environment than had previously existed. An exciting discovery was the presence of taro pollen. Taro is over on the far side over here, along with kumara. As taro really flowers in the short growing season and the pollen is not wind distributed, it indicates that there was taro garden present and that the gardens must have been deliberately overwintered, or the plants left behind after harvest in order to be mature enough to flower. High in the core were the kumara starch grains, up in here. which are left behind from growing crops and survive under favourable conditions. So from an environmental history perspective, burning the original vegetation changed the landscape, and over time was the catalyst for sand dunes on one side of the swamp and clay from the hillside on the other side of the swamp to wash into the valley. So last summer, we dug a trench across the swamp to try and learn a bit more about what was evident in the pollen core. And a series of channels were seen in section at different levels. And you can see here's one of these channels here. Here's another one. And this drawing shows that there's a whole series of trenches up the top and then quite a deep one at the base in Kaharoa. So it's right across there, which has been cut through by that trench. So at the base was the deep channel with large stones placed side by side across the channel to control the flow of water. The main channel had small feeder channels originating from springs on the clay hillside to maximise water capture, and the taro garden was situated adjacent to the channel and periodically flooded. So here we have this primary drain, and this was the taro garden on this side here, the hill slope going up that way. The series of channels higher in the deposit coincides with the presence of kumara, starch grains, after about 1500, when the taro garden was abandoned. So initially water was being drawn into the taro gardens, and then later away from the kumara gardens. So even on a small scale such as this 0.5 of a hectare swamp, there would have been considerable effort required to dig the base channel and to create taro garden made of clay and sand and enriched with abundant charcoal. The quantity of charcoal suggests that brushwood and other materials such as shell midden was brought into the gardens and burnt to improve fertility instead of fallowing these gardens and creating others. So this is the first evidence in New Zealand of irrigated taro and flowering taro plants, which indicate they could survive over the winter. The garden regime of the Polynesian arrivals would have been mixed with kumara, more easily grown than the taro and yam. But favourable places for growing taro warranted the effort being put into developing the infrastructure for irrigated gardens. And we argue that the islands, being slightly warmer than the mainland, and also the very far north of the North Island, were better propositions for this. So similar channels are used throughout the Pacific to reticulate and control water for irrigated taro gardening, again reinforcing that Māori gardens followed the long oceanic tradition of gardening. Also a surprise was the presence of herbaceous annuals in the sediment core. These plants, which favour open space, did not feature in the pollen cores in pre-human times. A similar pattern is present in the sediment cores on islands in eastern Polynesia, and it's possible that these plants were carried along with the true cultigens from one place to another in the kete in which they were, in the soil in which they were placed. While we think of the tuberous plants as being only crops, greens were also important in Polynesian diets, and these plants include sonchus, sow thistle or puha, the solanum or nightshade, and various cresses, including watercress. These plants thrived in the soil conditions of the gardens. Early European observers noted that Māori gardens were weed-free, and although these plants may not have been cultivated, it's highly likely that they were managed and eaten as greens, just as the puha and watercress continues to be an important component today. But I think we have to remember that that observation about the weed-free gardening was first noted by Cook and Banks, and they arrived in mid-October on the East Coast area, when the gardens were freshly dug and freshly planted. So it may not have had time for those greens to actually germinate. So that they may have actually given us a slightly misleading picture. In conclusion, like all good gardeners, Māori were adaptable in adopting new crops. First the kumara, and then after European arrival, the potato, maize and other plants. They were skilled horticulturalists, able to garden successfully in marginal climates, and were flexible in adjusting to changes in the environment and climate which required new techniques or abandonment of traditional methods. These qualities are most evident with the introduction of the potato, maize and other European fruit and vegetables. Maori gardeners fed the growing populations of Auckland and Wellington and exported produce to Sydney. They were highly successful. So just as they had adopted and successfully grown kumara, they were also highly successful with the production of other new crops. So, thank you.
You now have the opportunity to ask some questions. We're running a little before time, so if you have questions for Louise, please ask them. And if you have further questions for Amish, please do so. Down here.
Hi, thank you. How was the taro and kumara prepared, please, for eating?
For eating, the kumara was steamed in a hangi or earth oven, and they are delicious. They're not as sweet as the sweet potato that you see in the shops today, but the same with the taro. In Polynesia, puddings were made, and they could be steamed and then mixed with coconut milk, but of course coconuts couldn't grow here, so taro was likely just also steamed and then eaten.
Thank you. Am I switched on? Thank you very much. That was very illuminating to find particularly how recently New Zealand was inhabited by humans. I have two questions from that. Did they, the early Maori, start to use any of the indigenous plants as food sources? And were they entirely vegetarian if they didn't bring the chickens and pigs with them?
Well, the first question, there were tree species here that could be that were utilised by Māori, like karaka, a highly poisonous kernel to the karaka, but it contained a flour, a meal which could be ground up. But it required a lot of treatment and preparation in order to do that. But despite its toxicity, Māori did work out how to do that, and karaka became a staple food as well. But there were also a number of hino berries, tea toki. There were a range of seasonal foods, native foods, which could be eaten. If they didn't bring they still had fish, and fish and shellfish were probably a very large part of their diet. Also seals, the whole New Zealand coastline was inhabited by seals when Māori arrived. And of course they had the large birds like moa and other smaller birds which were also an important part of the diet.
Louise, oh, sorry.
I just have a question about some of the slides you showed of the walled gardens and pathways, and you could see them quite clearly in the landscape. Do those places, those archaeological places, get any protection in New Zealand, or how are they kind of managed as archaeological sites?
Most of them are actually on private land. You may have heard about the continuing situation at Ihumātao in Auckland. There is a garden system adjacent to the land that is under dispute at the moment. It is in public ownership, and it is the last surviving garden in the whole of the Auckland area. And, I think that as heritage people and also the local bodies have really dropped the ball over a long period of time, that there would have been thousands of hectares of Māori gardens, and we can see that from aerial photographs, thousands of hectares of gardens, and we've come down to only a few at Ahoo. And that was given a high level of protection in the 1990s because in recognition that it was the last surviving garden system. But most of them are on private land, and I have to say that a lot of the landowners are very aware and very appreciative of what they have on their land.
Louise, hello, it's Stuart. I've got a kumara question. And incidentally, Ahoo also was the only site in New Zealand where native cucumber was recorded, wasn't it? Botanically, it's almost extinct, but one little cucumber plant that's grown in that system of land. My question is, I read somewhere that New Zealand gave Japan a collection of kumara from all over the country, from all Maori communities and stuff, in about 1920, of literally hundreds of types, and we've lost most of those hundreds of types, as I think you've said. Are there any moves to get them back? Like, presumably, Asia's nuts about sweet potato.
It was actually much more recent than that. There was an ethnobotanist who worked for the DSIR in Pukekohe, just out of Auckland, by the name of Doug Yen, and he went all around Māori communities, and he gathered up the Māori potatoes that they were growing, which were European introductions, and their kumara varieties, and he trialled growing them at the DSIR station at Pukekohe. Doug got a job in Hawaii, and no one else in the DSIR wanted to continue with his experimental work on the kumara. He only had 3 varieties at that stage, so he sent them to the seed bank in Japan. In the 1990s, a woman by the name of Del Wihongi under Y262, which is the protection of Indigenous plants through the Waitangi Tribunal, she requested them back. And so these 3 kumara varieties came back to New Zealand, and that's how I acquired the Tapatini variety. They were given to the Open Polytechnic, and they entered into this experimental plot in Robin Hood Bay, along with 2 archaeologists. And as gardeners do, they brought along a box of these things to an archaeological conference and passed them around for people to look at. And I acquired 1 or 2 of them. As did a lot of other archaeologists. There were a lot of sleeves with kumara tubers poked up them at one stage, and I've just grown them since then. And I consider it my duty to grow them and then to pass them on to various Māori communities. And since then I've distributed them to Northland and to Coromandel and to Taranaki region, and I find it opens a lot of doors when you need to enter into any consultation with iwi if you take along a koha of some kumara. And only a few weeks ago I was given in exchange some rikamaroa, so it's the right time to get them in the ground now. So after this I'm heading back up to Coromandel next week, and I'll be planting my kumara.
Question. Most of your talk today has been about the warmer parts of New Zealand. There was Maori communities in the South Island. Is there any evidence of Maori gardens in likes of Karatani or Raupuki Island?
No, it's far too cold that far south. The southernmost evidence that we have is Banks Peninsula. Timuka actually. But they would have been very marginal and only possible to grow kumara there in really good seasons. Further south, couldn't grow any of the Māori tuberous crops, but the use of the cordyline, not the imported tea, but the indigenous tea, they grew and dug up and cooked the roots of the tea plant. Most of the gardens in the south would actually be the potato, Māori potato.
Yes, the use of charcoal as a fertiliser is very interesting because the Incas and Aztecs did that, and I was wondering if there was some sort of a relationship there. Was charcoal used in the other oceanic islands as a fertiliser? Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I think, charcoal is it's burning of the vegetation, and all you need is a rain event or something to put the fire out, and so you end up with charcoal in the soil. I don't think that they were deliberately aiming to get the charcoal. I think they were probably looking for the potash, the ash from the complete burning. But you do inevitably get the charcoal surviving. I don't think that there's any association with South America. This is something that's evident right through going further west in Oceania.
Richard.
No, it's a wonderful talk, thank you. What ways did they record yields, knowledge and recipes? What traditions?
Māori was an oral language, and things were handed down. Recipes, food was just steamed in the earth oven. There were no recipes as such. And the same with the greens. They were probably placed on top of the kumara in the hangi. A lot of the stories have been lost, and a lot of Māori communities really regret that even in the last 2 generations, things have been lost as the old people died out. And people I work with, Ngāti Hei and the Coromandel Peninsula, they say about their grandmother, but then so the kaumatua today, the older people, say that their grandmothers had this knowledge and they used to go out and plant on the islands, but then their mother thought that they would be better off growing up in the Pākehā world, and so that knowledge and that association has been lost.
Is there any evidence of gardening or growing amenity or plants for aesthetic purposes, for decorative purposes? Because certainly in Maori art, there are endemic plants reproduced, such as ferns. But I wondered whether they used or they grew any plants purely for decorative purposes.
For
decorative purposes.
Decorative purposes. I don't know that they actually grew them, but the forest was there to exploit things. And of course, Polynesians will put flowers in their hair and wear leaves, and Māori would have been the same. And the kawakawa piper species is definitely used in mourning. Even today, that women will wear a wreath of it in their hair.
Very briefly.
It's my limited observation that gardening goes hand in hand with the consumption of alcohol. And my question is, did the Maori peoples use the carbohydrate vegetables like taro for the brewing of alcohol?
No. No, the shorter answer is Māori did not make alcohol. And I would hope that gardeners drink alcohol after gardening.
Louise, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation, and would you please accept